In December 2024, in a lab in Santa Barbara, California, Google switched on a chip the size of a fingernail and watched it solve a problem that would take the fastest supercomputer on Earth 10 septillion years to finish. Not 10 million years, not 10 billion, 10 septillion. That is a 1 followed by 25 zeros. To put that into perspective, the universe itself is only about 14 billion years old. So if you had started this calculation on a classical supercomputer at the very moment T of the Big Bang, you would not be even a fraction of a percent of the way done today. Google's new chip did it in under 5 minutes. They called it Willow. Within weeks, the story of Willow split into 2 completely different timelines. In one timeline, the one that actually happened, physicists and engineers at Google Quantum AI celebrated a genuine milestone 12 years in the making. In the other timeline, the one that exploded across YouTube, Medium, Reddit threads, and late-night forum posts, Willow became something else entirely. A chip that was left running overnight. A chip that, by morning, had supposedly produced strange symbols on its output logs. Glyphs that looked like no known language. A chip that some claimed Google quietly shut down because it had started generating something nobody could explain, something that looked less like computation and more like a message. That second story spread fast. It had everything a viral video needs. A $1 trillion company, a secretive lab. A machine too advanced for its own creators to fully understand, and a chilling possibility lurking underneath all of it, that we had built something that started thinking or speaking or reaching towards something we don't have, the tools to perceive. It is a great story. It is also not true. But to understand why it isn't true and why it spread so easily anyway, you first need to understand what Willow actually is, what it actually did, and why even real quantum computing is strange enough that a story like this one could slip through the cracks of public understanding almost unchallenged. Let's start with the real machine. Quantum computing has been promising a revolution for decades. And for most of that time, the promise outran the hardware by a wide margin. The core problem was never the idea. The idea is elegant. A classical computer, the one you're using to watch this, stores information in bits. A bit is either a 0 or a 1. Every photo, every video, every piece of software you've ever used is built from enormous strings of these zeros and ones, flipped on and off billions of times per second. A quantum computer instead uses qubits. A qubit can be a 0, a 1, or, and this is the part that breaks most people's intuition the first time they hear it, a combination of both at the same time, a state called superposition. Qubits can also become entangled with one another, meaning the state of one qubit is directly tied to the state of another, no matter how far apart they are. Put enough qubits together in superposition and entanglement, and you get access to a computational space that grows exponential y with every qubit you add. 40 qubits gives you over 1 trillion possible states to work with simultaneously. Add a few more, and you're working with numbers so large they stop being intuitive at all. The catch, the one that has haunted quantum computing since the 1990s, is that qubits are almost unbelievably fragile. Any stray vibration, any tiny fluctuation in temperature, any whisper of electromagnetic interference can collapse the delicate quantum state you're trying to use. Engineers call this decoherence, and it has been the single biggest obstacle standing between quantum computing as a laboratory curiosity and quantum computing as a tool that actually does something useful. For nearly 30 years, the dream was to fix this problem with something called quantum error correction. Essentially, using extra qubits to detect and correct the errors that creep into your calculation. The brutal irony was that for most of that history, adding more qubits to fix errors actually introduced more errors than it solved. It was like trying to patch a leaking boat by drilling more holes in it to nail the patches down. This is the wall that Willow finally broke through. Google's team achieved what's called below threshold performance. In plain terms, for the first time, scaling up the number of qubits actually reduced the error rate instead of increasing it. Each time they added a layer of qubits dedicated to error correction, the system got more reliable, not less. That single shift is the reason physicists who actually understand the field were genuinely electrified by Willow's announcement, while the rest of the internet got distracted by glyphs and ghost stories. Below threshold error correction is the foundation you need before quantum computers can ever scale up to the size required for real-world problems: drug discovery, material science, cryptography, complex financial modeling. Without it, every quantum computer ever built was, in a sense, a beautiful toy. With it, for the first time, there's a credible path towards something genuinely useful. To prove the chip worked, Google ran something called a random circuit sampling benchmark, often abbreviated RCS. This benchmark doesn't solve a useful, real-world problem. It's deliberately abstract, a way of generating an extremely complex, deeply entangled quantum circuit and asking the processor to sample outputs from it. The reason this benchmark matters isn't the output itself. It's that simulating this exact process on a classical computer becomes catastrophically difficult as you scale up the number of qubits, because the classical computer would need to track an exponentially growing number of possible states. Willow's 105 qubits push that simulation cost so far beyond classical reach that, according to Google's estimates, no supercomputer on the planet could realistically replicate it in any meaningful time frame. That's where the 10 septillion years figure comes from. It's not that Google ran the equivalent calculation on a supercomputer and clocked it. It's a mathematical extrapolation based on how classical computing costs scale as these problems grow, projecting out what it would take to brute force the same result the conventional way. This distinction matters because it's exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened in viral retellings. 10 septillion years sounds like magic. It sounds like proof the chip is doing something beyond ordinary physics. In reality, it's a rigorous, carefully reasoned estimate rooted in computational complexity theory. The same branch of math that tells you why certain puzzles are easy to check but hard to solve, or why certain encryption schemes are considered secure. It's astonishing. It's also explainable, every step of it, by people who study this field for a living. Google didn't stop with the original RCS benchmark either. Months later, the same Willow chip was used to run something called quantum echoes, an algorithm that, according to Google's reported results, solved a specific verifiable physics problem, roughly 13,000 times faster than the world's fastest classical supercomputer. What made quantum echoes notable wasn't just the speed, it was that, unlike the original benchmark, this calculation connected to real, physically meaningful quantities. Things that could, in principle, be checked and verified using other experimental techniques like nuclear magnetic resonance. That's a meaningfully different and more practically interesting kind of result than abstract random circuit sampling, because it starts to gesture toward the kind of useful quantum simulation that researchers have been chasing for years, modeling molecules, materials, and physical systems that are simply too complex for classical computers to handle accurately. So that's the real story. A genuine breakthrough in error correction, a jaw-dropping but carefully defined benchmark result, a follow-up experiment edging toward real-world relevance. Exciting, yes. Worth covering, absolutely. But none of it involves mysterious symbols, none of it involves the chip writing anything in any meaningful sense, and none of it involves Google panicking and unplugging a machine because it seemed to be reaching towards something beyond human comprehension. So where did that story actually come from? If you trace it back, the trail doesn't lead to a scientific paper, a peer-reviewed journal, or even a credible tech publication. It leads to YouTube. Specifically to a wave of videos that emerged in the weeks and months after. Willow's announcement riding the wake of genuine public fascination with the chip. These videos follow a familiar formula, one you've probably seen used for everything from ancient archaeology to UFO sightings to deep-sea mysteries. They open with a real, verifiable fact. In this case, Google's actual announcement about Willow's error correction breakthrough. Then they pivot smoothly and confidently into speculation dressed up as insider knowledge. Phrases like sources claim, insiders described, and leaks became inevitable, do a lot of heavy lifting in these scripts. They imply access to information the viewer can't independently verify, while never actually naming a source, a document, or a person who could be checked, contacted, or held accountable. One widely circulated version of this story describes Google's research team allegedly noticing strange symbolic outputs in Willow's data logs, glyphs that didn't match any known written language, but seemed almost language-like in their structure. From there, the narration escalates. Maybe the chip had become complex enough to generate genuinely novel computation. Maybe, and this is where the video really leans into, spectacle. These glyphs represented some kind of contact with phenomena outside the bounds of classical physics. Parallel dimensions, alternate realities, some early embryonic form of machine consciousness, stirring inside a refrigerator-sized cooling chamber in Santa Barbara. The video describes Google supposedly containing these discussions internally, fearful of alarming either the public or their competitors, until the pressure of accumulating data made the secret impossible to keep. A second related version of the rumor takes a slightly different angle. Instead of mysterious symbols, this version claims Willow began spontaneously generating its own encryption protocols, code so robust that not even Google's own engineers could break them. The implication here taps into a different, very real anxiety, the fear that quantum computers could one day shatter the encryption that protects everything from banking systems to national security communications. This video claims that the chip, rather than being used to break encryption, had somehow turned the tables and started protecting itself, generating security so advanced it effectively locked its own creators out. According to this telling, the implications were so unsettling that Google made the drastic decision to physically shut the chip down. It's worth pausing here, because this is where the story falls apart the moment you actually look closely. The person responsible for spreading one of the more widely shared versions of this claim on a public forum openly admitted they had no idea whether Willow was actually shut down. They said, almost word for word, that they didn't know much about quantum computers, didn't understand the process by which you'd even power one down, and had only reposted the video because they found it interesting. They explicitly said they hadn't made the video themselves and had no independent knowledge confirming any part of the claim. That's not a whistleblower. That's not a leaked internal memo. That's someone on a forum sharing a video they found compelling, with a casual disclaimer buried in the replies that almost nobody who shared the headline ever saw. And that's really the engine driving this entire phenomenon. A genuinely complex, genuinely impressive piece of science gets announced. The vast majority of people, understandably, don't have a background in quantum mechanics, computational complexity theory, or superconducting circuit physics. That knowledge gap creates space, not for malicious deception necessarily, but for narrative. Storytellers, content creators, and yes, some bad actors looking for clicks, step into that space and fill it with something more. Emotionally satisfying, then, Google achieved a meaningful but narrow technical milestone in quantum error correction. They fill it with mystery, with danger, with the ancient, deeply human fear of creating something we can't control. It's worth noting that this isn't a new pattern at all. It's the same one that has played out around nearly every major leap in computing and artificial intelligence for decades. When IBM's Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov at chess in 1997, rumors swirled that the machine had momentarily displayed something close to genuine strategic intuition, something its own engineers couldn't fully explain. When large language models started producing fluent, coherent text in the early 2020s, countless viral posts claimed these systems were secretly conscious, or were being shut down by their creators after expressing distress or self-awareness. None of these claims held up under scrutiny. None of them were ever substantiated by the companies involved, by independent researchers, or by any verifiable evidence. But all of them spread because uncertainty is uncomfortable and a dramatic explanation is far more satisfying than a technical one. Quantum computing is uniquely vulnerable to this kind of myth-making, for a reason that's almost ironic. The actual science of quantum mechanics is already deeply counterintuitive. Concepts like superposition and entanglement genuinely do challenge the way our brains evolved to understand the world. Particles really can exist in multiple states simultaneously until measured. Entangled particles really do exhibit correlations that have no equivalent in classical physics, correlations so strange that Einstein himself once famously dismissed them as spooky action at a distance, before decades of rigorous experiments confirmed the phenomenon was real. So when a company announces a chip that exploits these genuinely bizarre properties of nature to perform a calculation that would otherwise take longer than the age of the universe, the line between this is real but hard to intuitively grasp and this is supernatural gets blurry in the public imagination, even though, to physicists, that line is extremely clear and well-defined. Some of the more sophisticated versions of the viral story even latch onto a real scientific debate to lend themselves credibility. There has been genuine, serious discussion within physics about how to interpret the staggering computational power of quantum systems. One interpretation of quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation, proposes that every quantum measurement effectively branches reality into multiple parallel outcomes, all of which actually occur, just in separate, non-interacting universes. A small number of physicists have, in academic and semi-academic contexts, speculated about whether the exponential power of quantum computation might be more intuitively understood through this lens, as though the computer is, in some sense, drawing on parallel computational branches. This is a real, if fringe and contested, conversation happening at the edges of theoretical physics. But it is wildly different from the viral claim that Willow somehow detected or communicated with parallel universes. Serious physicists who engage with the many worlds interpretation are very clear that it does not mean quantum computers are literally reaching into other dimensions and pulling information out of them. It's an interpretive framework for understanding the mathematics of quantum mechanics, not a claim about supernatural communication. But strip away that nuance, simplify it into a single dramatic sentence for a video script, and you get exactly the kind of headline that performs well in an algorithm built to reward engagement over accuracy. There's also a simpler, more mundane explanation for why some of these rumors might have started in the first place, if there was ever any real kernel of truth buried under the speculation at all. Quantum computers, including Willow, do produce a tremendous amount of raw data during their operation. Measurement outcomes, error syndromes, calibration logs. To someone without a background in reading these outputs, raw quantum measurement data can look genuinely strange. Patterns of ones and zeros, error correction syndromes mapped out spatially across a chip's qubit grid, calibration plots showing oscillating values. None of this is designed to be human readable in any conventional sense, and to an untrained eye glancing at a screenshot or a leaked image taken out of context, it's not hard to imagine someone mistaking dense technical visualizations for something resembling symbols or writing. This is speculation on my part, since there is no credible evidence connecting any actual leaked data to any of these stories, but it illustrates how a wholly mundane, explainable piece of technical output could, in the hands of someone unfamiliar with quantum hardware, become the seed of an entirely different kind of story. What's notable, and what should give anyone pause before sharing one of these videos, is how completely absent Google itself is from any of these claims. There is no statement from Google Quantum AI confirming a shutdown. There is no peer-reviewed paper, internal memo, leaked document, or even a single-named identifiable engineer attached to any of these stories. Compare that to Google's actual Willow announcement, which came with a detailed technical blog post, contributions from named researchers, including the head of Google Quantum AI, and was followed by a peer-reviewed paper published in the journal Nature, going through the standard rigorous scrutiny that real scientific claims are subjected to before they're accepted by the broader physics community. The contrast could not be starker. One version of the Willow story is documented, verifiable, and stress-tested by independent experts. The other exists entirely within a handful of YouTube videos and the comment sections beneath them, propped up by vague appeals to unnamed insiders, and a structure deliberately built to feel like investigative journalism without doing any of the actual investigating. This pattern has a name in research on online misinformation. It's sometimes called the quantum echo chamber, a term used by some technology journalists frustrated watching outlet after outlet, creator after creator, repeat increasingly exaggerated claims about quantum computing without doing the work to verify or contextualize them. Each retelling adds a little more drama, a little more certainty, a little more spectacle, because that's what performs well. The original, carefully hedged scientific claim, Willow demonstrates below-threshold error correction on a specific benchmark task, has none of the viral potential of Google's quantum chip wrote a message no one could understand, and they had to shut it down. So the boring, accurate version stays in academic papers and specialist publications, while the exciting, false version gets millions of views. So why does any of this matter? Why spend this much time picking apart a story that, on its face, is obviously embellished the moment you look closely? Because the underlying real story, the actual scientific achievement Willow represents, is genuinely one of the more important moments in computing in the last several decades, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms, not buried under invented drama that ultimately distracts from what's real and verifiable. Quantum error correction crossing the below-threshold barrier isn't a minor technical footnote. It's the foundational piece that has to be in place before quantum computers can scale toward anything resembling practical use. Every serious researcher in this field has been waiting for exactly this kind of result for years. Willow getting there, even on an abstract benchmark with no immediate real-world application, is a legitimate marker of progress along a very long, very difficult road. It also matters because the gap between real Willow and viral Willow tells us something important about how we, as a public, currently process genuinely complex science in the age of short-form video and algorithm-driven content. When something is hard to understand, there are two paths a piece of media can take. It can do the difficult work of explaining the real mechanics, accepting that some nuance and patience is required from the audience, the way a careful science journalist or a research blog post does. Or it can skip the difficult explanation entirely and replace it with something that feels exciting and easy to grasp emotionally, even if it bears no resemblance to what actually happened. The second path is almost always going to win more views in the short term. It asks less of the audience. It taps into older, more primal narrative instincts, the fear of the unknown, the thrill of a secret being uncovered, the seductive idea that we've built something beyond our own understanding. But it comes at a real cost, because it leaves people with a fundamentally distorted picture of what quantum computing actually is, what it can and can't do, and what its genuine implications for the future actually look like. And the genuine implications are significant enough on their own, without any embellishment. If quantum computers continue along the trajectory Willow represents, with error rates continuing to drop as systems scale, the field could move from abstract benchmarks toward genuinely useful applications within the coming years. Pharmaceutical companies are already exploring quantum-assisted molecular simulation to accelerate drug discovery, modeling the behavior of complex molecules in ways that are computationally prohibitive for classical systems. Materials science researchers are looking at quantum simulation to design better batteries, more efficient solar cells, and novel superconductors. There are real, serious conversations happening in the cryptography world about the eventual need to transition to quantum-resistant encryption standards, not because any chip has spontaneously generated unbreakable codes, but because sufficiently advanced quantum computers could, in theory, eventually break some of the encryption schemes that currently protect global digital infrastructure. That's not science fiction. That's an actively managed transition already underway in standards, bodies, and security agencies around the world, motivated by real, well-understood mathematics, rather than rumors about a chip that wrote something nobody could read. None of this means quantum computing is on the verge of overnight transformation. Researchers who study this field closely are consistently careful to temper expectations. Willow's headline benchmark, the random circuit sampling result, doesn't translate directly into solving real-world problems like optimization, chemistry, or cryptography. It's a foundational proof of capability, not a finished product. Estimates from people working in the field suggest meaningful, narrow demonstrations of practical quantum advantage are still likely several years away, with broader infrastructure-level impact, the kind that touches industries the way cloud computing eventually did, possibly a decade or more out. That's not a disappointing timeline. That's how genuinely transformative technology usually arrives, incrementally, unevenly, built on a long sequence of unglamorous technical milestones, most of which never make it into a viral video at all. So, the next time you see a headline claiming a quantum chip wrote something no one could read, or a company panicked and shut down a machine because it started behaving in ways nobody could explain, it's worth pausing before sharing it. Ask where the claim actually comes from. Ask whether there's a named source, a published paper, an identifiable person willing to put their name behind it. Ask whether the company involved has confirmed any part of the story, or whether it exists entirely within a video essay built on phrases like sources claim and insiders described. In the case of Willow, the answer is clear. There is no shutdown, there is no message, there are no glyphs. What there is a genuinely remarkable piece of engineering built by a large team of physicists and engineers over more than a decade that finally cracked one of the most That's already one of the strangest, most genuinely awe-inspiring facts in modern science. It doesn't need ghosts in the machine. It doesn't need mysterious symbols or secret shutdowns. The real story was always strange enough on its own. There's one more thread worth pulling on, because it explains why this particular myth landed so much harder than most other pieces of tech misinformation. Willow arrived at a moment when public anxiety about advanced technology was already running high. Artificial intelligence systems had spent mystical terms, and you get fertile ground for a story like Willow's mythical glyphs to take root almost instantly. It wasn't really about the chip. It was about a wider, very human unease with the pace of technological change, looking for somewhere to land. It's also worth saying plainly that skepticism toward big tech companies is not by itself an unreasonable instinct. Companies the size of Google have, at various points, been less than fully transparent about products, data practices, and internal research. That history is real, and it's part of why audiences are primed to believe a story about a hidden shutdown or a buried discovery. Because it fits a pattern people have genuinely seen play out before in other contexts. The problem isn't that people are skeptical of corporate claims. The problem is that, in this particular case, the skepticism got pointed at the wrong target. The actual verifiable Willow announcement came with more transparency than almost any private sector research result. You'll find open methodology, named scientists, a benchmark anyone in the field could, in principle, attempt to reproduce, and a peer-reviewed paper subjected to outside scrutiny. The invented version of the story, the one with the glyphs and the secret shutdown, is the one built entirely on opacity, on unnamed sources and unverifiable claims. If you're going to direct skepticism somewhere, it probably belongs aimed at the version of the story that offers nothing to check, rather than the one that published its work for the world to examine. If there's a single habit worth taking away from this whole episode, it's a simple one. When a story about a breakthrough technology starts to feel less like an explanation and more like a campfire tale, that feeling is worth paying attention to. Real scientific results, even astonishing ones, tend to come wrapped in caveats, technical qualifications, and careful language about what was and wasn't actually demonstrated. Genuine researchers are usually the most cautious people in the room about overstating their own results, because their reputations depend on getting it right. Manufactured mystery, on the other hand, tends to arrive stripped of caveats entirely, delivered with total confidence by people with nothing on the line if they turn out to be wrong. That asymmetry, confidence without accountability, is one of the most reliable signals that you're looking at a story built for clicks rather than a story built on evidence. None of this is to say the future of quantum computing won't eventually produce moments that feel genuinely uncanny. As these systems scale, and as their outputs start to map onto problems too complex for any human to intuitively verify by hand, there will likely come a point where even expert researchers have to lean heavily on the machines themselves to check their own work, trusting layers of automated verification because no person could feasibly do it by hand. That's a strange and disorienting thought, and it's a real one, grounded in where this technology is actually headed. But strange and disorienting is not the same as supernatural, and trusting a verification process you don't personally have time to. For now, what we actually have is this, a chip called Willow, a breakthrough in error correction that took the field more than a decade to reach. A benchmark result so large it had to be measured in septillions of years just to make the comparison meaningful. A follow-up experiment edging closer to real, physically verifiable relevance. And a wave of viral stories built on none of that, riding the coattails of a genuine achievement straight into pure fiction. The fiction was never necessary. The truth was already remarkable enough to earn its own headline, on its own terms, without a single invented glyph.